I've never done one of these before, so here goes. And thank you, Melanie, for saving Friday afternoon for the dense, heavy technical topics. So I'm going to talk about blockchain. So there's been a little bit of talk about blockchains in our industry lately, and really blockchains are being discussed in the realm of being sure. Are we sure that our accesses are private, Tim already Bond? Are we sure that our systems are secure? Are we sure that our assets aren't being compromised? And so we need systems that can provide that surety. We need things that are secure so that we know that they're accurate. So if something is compromised, it's no longer accurate at that point. It needs to be private, so our end users need to be able to be sure that their usage is private and confidential in their own world. When data is created, your data is created anywhere. You're entrusting that to another company or individual, like a Google or Facebook. Can we be sure that our content is safe, and can we be sure that it's not being accessed illegally? Well, I think we can all be pretty sure that it is. But what can we do about that? And what does that mean in the sense of we've got these sort of competing principles here of trying to keep things private, trying to keep things secure, and trying to keep them away from the pirated systems, if you will, the sci-hubs of the world. And each one of these pulls a little bit in a different direction. So one of the solutions that's being talked about is the blockchain, and I have a really strange analogy for how blockchains work. It's as if they were a stack of Legos that were epoxied together. And I'll work through this with you over the next 6 minutes and 20 seconds. That hopefully makes sense. But the idea is that it's additive only. You first saw blockchains coming about because of Bitcoin. That was the original application. But blockchain is a separate technological invention that Bitcoin uses in order to do monetary transactions. But that's not the only use for a blockchain. And what we're going to talk about here is sort of the generic use case for a blockchain. So you start with a transaction, and I'm going to use Bitcoin because it's the sort of most common use case at the point. Start with a transaction. Somebody wants to make a purchase. I send $5 to Amazon to buy a movie, for example. Within the blockchain system, I am an anonymous user. In other words, I have a unique identifier that identifies me, but no one knows who's behind that. That transaction gets recorded into a ledger. This is just like the real world analogy, but in this case, that's two unique identifiers that are coming together with an exchange of currency for some good or service. Then there's a validation process. This is the part where most people get confused. There's a validation process for a transaction. This is deliberately made to be difficult to do. And these are done by specialized computers, by groups that are investing in blockchain technology. They go through a very, very complex algorithm system in order to validate a transaction. And that's where a lot of the detail goes into blockchain that's not necessarily super relevant for us. The important thing is those miners get paid for doing that work. It's not altruistic. They are validating transactions that they have nothing to do, but they're getting paid for that in cryptocurrency. And cryptocurrency has its own value in and of itself. You can exchange for goods and services, you can invest in it, lots of things like that. The important thing is that blockchains are decentralized. So unlike a banking system where Bank of America holds all the transactions, if that's compromised, then all that data is gone. Blockchains, ledgers are copied all over the world. It's kind of like the locks and clocks equivalent of ledgers. And so the idea is that because those copies are all equivalent, they need to match. And if they don't match, then yours gets sort of voted off the community because yours is corrupted in some way. That's how it sort of heals itself. So what can it do? Because the users are publicly anonymous, which means that you have your unique identifier. You can think of it kind of like a ORCID ID, but it's untraceable. Your public records, your public transactions are completely anonymous. Boy, I'm losing my place here. But in our case, just to bring this into our industry, the transaction that we're talking about is content access. And so what does that mean? That means that an individual with that unique ID, it could be in a browser plugin, or they could be signed into a system, or a computer, or a device, or a phone. With the unique ID, they access a piece of content that also has a unique ID. And when those two things come together, that's a transaction that in turn gets validated by the miners and pushed out to those public ledgers all over the world. The idea there is that it's completely anonymous in terms of the public face of it, but it's completely accurate and unfallible. It's a very secure system for that reason. It's very private. It's also fairly easy to use because in other cases, in other industries, you can actually use your public ID very easily in a browser, or using biometrics or anything like that. There are some challenges though. The system, because it uses so much computational power, hasn't scaled to a massive level yet in any use case. So if we're talking about passing through every content transaction that we're talking about in our industry, there would need to be some scaling involved with that, both in terms of the computers that are being used and that kind of thing. We also need to totally rework all of our access methods. So that sounds like fun, right? So that would be, certainly on the platform publisher level, but certainly institutions and all that would need to sort of get together to adopt this system. That doesn't mean that there'll be miners. That just means that they would need to be using these unique identifiers. And this is just the beginning. So there's a number of blockchain platforms out there. Bitcoin is just one of them. There's things like smart contracts, and it's exploding right now. So the future is well ahead of us at this point. Thank you.